My name is Clara Hayes. I'm 28 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I was sure I understood the meaning of family. It was a definition taught to me more by my grandparents than by my own parents, one built on values that became the bedrock of my life. When they passed away just months apart, I was shattered. But what I never could have prepared for was that their deaths would unearth a $22 million inheritance, an inheritance that would twist my parents into people I no longer recognized. Before I get into the story of how my own mother and father tried to take everything from me, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And please, hit that subscribe button if you've ever found yourself having to take a stand against the very people you're supposed to trust the most. Growing up, my relationship with my grandparents, Margaret and Arthur Vance, was the core of my world. While other kids were at the mall or at sleepovers, my weekends were spent in their warm, slightly cluttered craftsman home on Elm Ridge Road. I'd be in the kitchen helping Grandma Margaret bake her legendary peach cobbler, the whole house smelling of cinnamon and sugar, or sitting on the porch swing listening to Grandpa Arthur's stories about his early days as a civil engineer, building bridges that still stood strong. My parents, Helen and Richard Hayes, were always more like distant, polished figures in my life. They were high-powered corporate executives, a duo constantly on the move. Their ambition meant that I spent far more of my childhood with my grandparents than I ever did with them. From kindergarten straight through high school, it wasn't uncommon for me to stay at my grandparents' house for weeks on end while my parents were jetting off to conferences in Zurich, Singapore, or Dubai. "Your parents are building something important," Grandma Margaret would tell me, sensing my disappointment after they'd missed yet another school play or birthday. "But while they're gone, we get to have our special time together." She had a gift for making me feel treasured, not like an afterthought. My grandparents never came across as wealthy. They lived frugally, in the same house they'd bought 40 years earlier. Grandpa drove the same old Chevy truck for what felt like my entire life, and Grandma Margaret would meticulously darn socks instead of just buying a new pair. "Waste not, want not," was one of her go-to phrases. They taught me about the importance of saving, of caring for your possessions, and of finding real joy in the simple things. Every summer, we had a tradition of camping near Willow Creek Lake. We'd spend our days fishing from a small rowboat, hiking trails that Grandpa had known since he was a boy, and sharing stories around a crackling campfire at night. Grandpa taught me to pick out constellations, to build a fire that would last through the night, and how to spot deer tracks in the soft earth. Grandma taught me how to cook a perfect meal over an open flame, which wild plants were safe to eat, and how to find my way using the sun and stars. These weren't just fun trips. They were lessons in self-reliance and having a deep respect for the world around us. When I turned 18, my parents had a clear path envisioned for me, business or law, something practical that would lead to a 6-figure salary, just like theirs. But my grandparents were the ones who encouraged me to follow my heart. I wanted to study environmental science. "An education is never a waste, Clara," Grandpa would say, his hand on my shoulder. "Learn what fills your heart with purpose, and the rest will fall into place." With their unwavering emotional support, I went to college for environmental conservation. It was a choice that baffled my parents, but it made me deeply, genuinely happy. My parents' world revolved around status and material gain. They lived in a sterile, minimalist penthouse in downtown Chicago, drove sleek German cars, and took extravagant vacations. Their dinner conversations were a whirlwind of stock portfolios, property values, and the latest corporate ladder climbing. In stark contrast, my grandparents talked about the community garden, the books they were reading, and the vital importance of character. A good name is worth more than all the gold in the world, Grandpa would often tell me. It wasn't until much later that I understood just how profoundly they lived by that creed, even when it came to their own fortune. Throughout my entire childhood and into my young adult years, I had absolutely no clue that my grandparents had amassed any significant wealth. They never spoke about money, except in the context of teaching practical lessons about saving money and staying out of debt. Looking back, the clues were there, but they were subtle. Their quiet but consistent charitable giving to local causes. The fact that they paid for my entire college education without ever mentioning the cost or seeming to feel a financial strain, and the deep, almost reverent respect that other older folks in our town of Oak Haven had for them, a respect that went beyond just their age. After college, I found a job with a conservation nonprofit right there in Oak Haven, working to protect the local watersheds. My parents viewed my career choice with thinly veiled disappointment. With your degree, you could be making six figures at a top environmental consulting firm, my father would remark during our infrequent, stilted phone calls. Meanwhile, my grandparents were front and center at every community meeting where I spoke, their faces beaming with pride. When Grandma Margaret was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 3 years ago, I didn't think twice about moving back into their home to help care for her. My parents immediately suggested hiring a full-time nurse, even offering to pay for it so I could focus on advancing my career. But I refused. Those final years with my grandparents were more precious than any promotion, filled with deeper conversations and a stronger bond as we navigated her declining health together. Grandpa and I fell into a routine. Every morning, we'd help Grandma with her physical therapy exercises. Then we'd all have breakfast together. I'd go to work, but I'd always come home during my lunch break to check on them. In the evenings, we'd sit together on their big wraparound porch, watching the sun dip below the hills. Grandpa would hold Grandma's hand, which trembled more and more, and they would reminisce about their 62 years of marriage. "Take care of each other," Grandma often whispered to me during those quiet sunset talks. In the end, how you treat people is all that matters. I thought she was just sharing her life philosophy. I had no idea she was trying to prepare me for what was to come. The day Grandma Margaret passed away was overcast and drizzly, a perfect match for the heaviness in my heart. She died peacefully in her sleep, after a surprisingly good day where she had been clear-headed and talkative. We had spent the afternoon looking through old photo albums, and she'd told me stories about her own childhood that I'd never heard before. It felt like a final, precious gift of clarity before she was gone forever. Grandpa Arthur was a pillar of strength at the funeral, standing tall despite his 84 years. He greeted every single mourner with a quiet dignity, thanking them for coming to celebrate Margaret's life. My parents flew in from a business trip in San Francisco, arriving just a couple of hours before the service began. They stood awkwardly at the reception, accepting condolences from people who had known my grandmother for decades, people they barely recognized. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," my mother said stiffly on the drive back to the house. It struck me as such a formal, detached thing to say about her own mother, and it just highlighted the emotional chasm that had always defined our family. What none of us saw coming was how quickly Grandpa would follow her. Just 3 months later, he passed away in his favorite armchair, a book of poetry open on his lap. The doctor called it heart failure, but everyone who knew them said he died of a broken heart. In over 6 decades of marriage, they had rarely spent a single day apart. His funeral was smaller, more intimate, but no less emotional. And again, my parents flew in, this time from Chicago, where they were in the middle of closing a major deal. They seemed genuinely sad but also restless, constantly checking their phones during the service. I overheard my father telling someone they had to be on a plane back first thing in the morning. The day after the funeral, we all gathered at the house for a small family reception. My uncle Timothy, my father's brother, was there with his wife and their 2 teenage kids. A few of my mother's cousins were there too. There was an uncomfortable tension in the room, a palpable sense of expectation that hung in the air like smoke. "So," my Uncle Timothy said during a long, awkward pause, "I suppose we'll be meeting with the lawyer soon to discuss the estate." He shot a meaningful glance at my father, who nodded. "I've already spoken with Samuel Peterson," my father said. "He was their attorney for decades. We're meeting him tomorrow morning." I was a little taken aback that they had arranged this without even mentioning it to me, but I was too emotionally exhausted to say anything. The next morning, we all drove to a modest office building downtown where Samuel Peterson had his law practice. He was an elderly man with kind, weary eyes and a very formal demeanor, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit despite the summer humidity. Mr. Peterson's office felt like a time capsule, with dark wood paneling, walls lined with leather-bound books, and a heavy antique desk that took up most of the room. He greeted each of us by name, offering his sincere condolences before getting down to business. "I worked with Arthur and Margaret Vance for over 40 years," he began, adjusting his spectacles. "They were thoughtful, deliberate people. They knew exactly what they wanted." He opened a large folder and removed a thick document. "This is their last will and testament, updated just 6 months ago, before Margaret's health began to decline significantly." He cleared his throat and started to read. The first few minutes were filled with standard legal jargon, and my mind started to drift, replaying memories of my grandparents. Then, Mr. Peterson said something that jolted me back to reality. "To our beloved granddaughter, Clara Hayes, we leave our entire estate, including all financial assets, properties, and personal belongings." The room fell completely silent. I looked up and saw every pair of eyes in the room fixed on me. My father's face was ashen, while my mother's was flushed with a deep, angry red. My Uncle Timothy's mouth was literally hanging open. "There must be some mistake," my father said finally, his voice strained. Mr. Peterson slowly shook his head. "There is no mistake, Richard. Arthur and Margaret were exceptionally clear about their wishes." He turned a page. "The estate includes their home and property, valued at approximately $2 million, investment accounts and stocks valued at approximately $19.5 million, and personal property valued at approximately $500,000. I felt dizzy. $22 million. It was an amount I couldn't even fathom. My grandparents, the people who mended their own clothes and drove an old truck, had quietly built a fortune. "They also left this letter for you, Clara," Mr. Peterson said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written on it, in Grandpa's familiar, steady handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read silently. "Dearest Clara, if you are reading this, both Margaret and I have moved on from this life. Do not grieve too long for us. We lived full and happy lives, and having you in them was one of our greatest joys. You may be surprised by our decision to leave everything to you. Over the years, we watched you grow into a person of integrity and compassion. While others in the family pursued wealth for its own sake, you pursued purpose. You chose to care for us in our final years, not out of duty, but out of pure love. We accumulated this wealth slowly and carefully over many decades through prudent investments and a simple lifestyle. We never spoke of it because we wanted our family to value what truly matters: character, kindness, and human connection. Sadly, we watched as your parents became increasingly fixated on status and material success, values we do not share. We trust you to use this inheritance wisely in ways that reflect the principles we tried to instill in you. You do not need to share it, though you may choose to do so as your heart guides you. This is your inheritance, Clara, not family property to be divided or controlled by others. With all our love and confidence in you, Grandpa Arthur and Grandma Margaret. Tears were streaming down my face by the time I finished. The letter was a confirmation of everything I had always felt, that my grandparents and I shared a bond that went deeper than blood, based on shared values and genuine love. "This is outrageous," my mother hissed, her voice rising in pitch. "We are their children. How could they cut us out completely?" Mr. Peterson remained unflappable. "They did not make this decision lightly, Mrs. Hayes. They discussed their reasoning with me at great length." "We will contest this," my father announced, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. Clearly they were not of sound mind. "You are welcome to try," Mr. Peterson replied evenly. "But I can assure you Arthur and Margaret were meticulously thorough in documenting their mental competence. They underwent full psychological evaluations, specifically to prevent such challenges." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't decipher. Then, without another word, they stormed out of the office, leaving me alone with Mr. Peterson and a future that had just become terrifyingly complicated. "Take some time to process all of this, Clara," Mr. Peterson said kindly. "There's no rush to make any decisions. The house is yours now, and everything in it. Your grandparents trusted you completely." As I left his office, I felt a strange mix of being overwhelmed by the responsibility and profoundly validated by my grandparents' faith in me. I had no idea that the real battle had only just begun. 3 days after that meeting in the lawyer's office, my parents invited me to dinner at their hotel suite. They had extended their stay, postponing their trip back to Chicago indefinitely. When I got there, I found they had ordered an extravagant meal from room service, complete with a bottle of wine that I knew cost several $100s. "Sit down, Clara," my father said, gesturing to the elegantly set table. His tone was smooth and conciliatory, a world away from the cold fury he'd shown at the lawyers. "We've had some time to think, and we want to discuss the situation like rational adults." I sat down cautiously, accepting a glass of water instead of the wine. My mother gave me a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We were shocked by your grandparents' decision," she began. "But we understand they were very fond of you, and we recognize that you took good care of them in their final years," my father added, cutting into his filet mignon. "That deserves to be acknowledged." Their sudden shift in tone was unsettling. This wasn't the angry showdown I had braced myself for. It was something far more calculated. "That being said," my father continued, placing his knife and fork down, $22 million is a tremendous responsibility. Managing that kind of wealth requires expertise and experience that, frankly, you simply don't possess at your age. "What your father is saying," my mother interjected smoothly, "is that we should approach this as a family. Family money should be handled by family decision makers." "I have 25 years of experience in investment banking," my father said, leaning forward. "I could grow that $22 million into $40 million within 5 years, with the right strategy." I took a sip of water, choosing my words carefully. "I appreciate your concern, but Grandma and Grandpa were very clear about what they wanted. I plan to honor their wishes." My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he kept his pleasant expression. Clara, there's something you should know. Your mother and I have been facing some financial challenges recently. This was a shock. My parents had always projected an image of untouchable success. The luxury penthouse, designer clothes, exotic vacations several times a year. The economic downturn hit some of our investments very hard, my mother explained, her voice taking on a note of vulnerability. We have significant loans that are coming due. We always planned to ask your grandparents for assistance, but then Margaret got sick, and it just never seemed like the right time. The implication hung heavy in the air. They expected me to bail them out, but something about their story felt off. We're not asking for a handout, my father clarified quickly. Just a partnership. You transfer the assets into a family trust that we manage together, with my expertise guiding the investments. And naturally, a portion would be used to resolve our current difficulties, my mother added. I thought about my grandparents' letter, about their careful observations of my parents' values. How much do you owe? I asked directly. My parents exchanged a quick glance. About $4 million, my father admitted. But that's not the point. The point is that you're a 28-year-old with no financial background. Do you really think you can manage this kind of money without making catastrophic mistakes? His condescending tone lit a spark in me. For my entire life, my parents had dismissed my choices, my education, my career, my values. Now they were dismissing my ability to honor the one thing my grandparents had asked of me. I may not have your financial expertise, I said, my voice steady, but I have Mr. Peterson to advise me, and I can hire financial managers who will respect my wishes, not push their own agenda. My father's pleasant mask finally cracked. This is absurd. We are your parents. That money should be under our control. It is under family control, I replied. Mine. My mother's face hardened. You have no idea the sacrifices we made for you. While you were off having fun baking with your grandmother, we were working 60-hour weeks to provide for this family. To provide what? I asked, a genuine question. You were hardly ever there. Grandma and Grandpa raised me more than you did. It was as if I had slapped her. How dare you? We gave you everything. The conversation fell apart quickly after that. My father admitted they had borrowed extensively from my grandparents over the years, loans that, I now realized, had been forgiven in the will. It became painfully clear that their lavish lifestyle had been partially bankrolled by my frugal grandparents all along. Your grandparents always intended for that money to stay with the primary family line, my father insisted. They would never have wanted you to exclude us like this. That's not what their letter said, I countered, thinking of the carefully chosen words about character and choices. My mother's voice turned tearful, a calculated performance. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By hoarding your grandparents' fortune while your own parents struggle? I felt a sharp pang of guilt, but it was quickly followed by anger at the blatant manipulation. I need time to think, I said, standing up. This is all still very new. My father's expression turned to ice. Don't take too long. Family loyalty only stretches so far, Clara. Either you work with us on this, or you're on your own. I left the hotel with my hands shaking, tears threatening to spill. For the first time, I was seeing my parents for who they really were, not as successful, busy people who were simply too occupied to be present, but as transactional, manipulative individuals who saw relationships as financial opportunities. As I drove back to what was now my house, I knew that dinner hadn't been an attempt at reconciliation. It was the opening salvo in what was about to become a war over my grandparents' legacy. The 2 weeks that followed that disastrous dinner were a masterclass in psychological warfare. It started with hourly phone calls from both parents, a dizzying rotation of guilt trips, veiled threats, and brief flashes of fake reconciliation that would inevitably pivot back to demands for the money. "We only want what's best for the family," my mother would say, before adding, "Your grandparents would be so disappointed to see how selfish you've become." My father took a more menacing tack. "You do realize we could challenge the will on grounds of undue influence," he told me during one call. "It would tie up every penny in legal battles for years. Nobody wins in that scenario, Clara." I started screening my calls, which only made them escalate their tactics. 3 days after the dinner, my Uncle Timothy called. "Your father tells me you're refusing to help them, even with their financial troubles," he said, his tone dripping with disapproval. "Family is supposed to support family, Clara." By the end of that first week, I had received similar calls from 5 other extended family members, none of whom had shown any real interest in my life before this. It was clear my parents were systematically rallying the family against me, painting a picture of themselves as the victims of my greed rather than as opportunists trying to seize control of my inheritance. The isolation started to get to me. My few close friends were supportive but couldn't really grasp the toxic complexity of the situation. "They're still your parents," my friend Danielle said gently after I vented to her. "Maybe there's a compromise?" Even people who had known my grandparents for years began to look at me differently. At the grocery store, Mrs. Peterson, who was in my grandmother's garden club, approached me with a look of concern. "I heard things are difficult with your parents right now," she said. "Your grandmother always worried so much about family harmony. I'm sure she'd want you to find a way to make peace." It dawned on me that my parents were spreading their version of the story all over town. The selfish granddaughter who manipulated her elderly grandparents into disinheriting their own children, then cruelly refused to share the windfall. The pressure mounted when they started showing up at my workplace. The first time, my mother appeared in the reception area of the conservation nonprofit where I worked, tearfully telling my colleagues she was just so worried about my mental state since my grandparents' deaths. My supervisor, Alan, called me into his office later. "Family issues should stay at home, Clara," he said uncomfortably. "We can't have scenes like that disrupting the office." The second time, my father arrived during a staff meeting, insisting he had to speak to me immediately about a family emergency. When I stepped outside to talk to him, there was no emergency. There were only more demands about the inheritance. The constant stress was wrecking me. I couldn't sleep, I had no appetite, and I couldn't concentrate. I felt hunted in my own town, the one place that had always been my sanctuary. After my father's stunt at my office, I made a decision. I would temporarily move into my grandparents', now my house, to find some peace. That craftsman home on Elm Ridge had always been my safe haven, a place filled with warm memories and a profound sense of belonging. I packed a few essentials and drove over after work, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as I pulled into the familiar driveway. The house was quiet, but it was a comforting silence. I walked through the rooms, running my fingers along the spines of the books Grandpa Arthur had collected, touching the intricate quilts Grandma Margaret had stitched by hand. For the first time since their deaths, I felt their presence, a quiet reminder of what they had wanted for me. That peace lasted for exactly 43 hours. I was out in the garden, tending to my grandmother's prized roses, when I heard the front door open and close. Thinking it might be Mr. Peterson, who had promised to drop off some paperwork, I headed inside. Instead, I found my parents standing in the middle of the living room, looking around as if they were assessing the property. "How did you get in?" I demanded, my heart starting to pound. My mother held up a key. "We've always had a key, Clara. This was our parents' house." "And now it's mine," I said firmly, You can't just walk in here whenever you feel like it. Actually, my father said, his voice a cold, pleasant purr. We wanted to discuss the house specifically. Your grandparents promised us years ago that this house would eventually come to us. It was a verbal agreement, but a binding one. I stared at him, dumbfounded. That contradicts everything in the will and their personal letter. People change their minds, especially when they're being influenced by someone living with them, someone they're dependent on, my mother said pointedly. I was caring for them, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. You were isolating them from their own children during their most vulnerable final years, my father countered. A court would find that very interesting. The conversation spiraled into the ugliest confrontation we'd had yet. My father produced a set of documents he wanted me to sign, papers that would essentially transfer control of most of the inheritance to them. We're prepared to let you keep the house and $2 million, he said, as if this was a generous compromise. The rest returns to its rightful place under family leadership. When I refused to even look at the papers, my mother's face twisted with rage. This is our house, she shouted. Your grandparents promised it to us 2 decades ago. You need to get your things and get out. I will not leave my own home, I said, standing my ground even though my hands were shaking. Then we'll have you removed, my father said coldly, and file for an emergency injunction to freeze the assets until the will can be properly challenged. They left with one final warning. I had 24 hours to come to my senses before they took legal action. The moment their car was out of sight, I called Mr. Peterson in tears and told him everything. Change the locks immediately, he advised, his voice firm. They have no legal right to enter your property without permission, regardless of whether they have a key, and don't worry about their threats. The will is airtight. I called a locksmith that afternoon, but the feeling of violation lingered. My childhood sanctuary, the one place on earth I felt truly safe, had been invaded by the very people who should have been protecting me. 3 days after I changed the locks, I came home from grocery shopping to find an unfamiliar car parked in my driveway, right behind my parents' luxury SUV. As I pulled up, I saw that the front door was wide open, and a woman in a business suit was standing on the porch, making notes on a tablet. With a sickening lurch in my stomach, I knew what was happening. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I walked toward the house. "Excuse me," I called out to the woman, "what are you doing at my home?" She turned, a professional smile plastered on her face. "Oh, you must be Clara. I'm Brittany Lewis from Pinnacle Realty. Your parents are just showing me the property for a potential urgent sale. They mentioned you'd be moving out soon." Before I could even form a response, my father appeared in the doorway. "Clara, good timing. Brittany is helping us evaluate the house for a quick sale. The market is excellent right now." I stood frozen on the lawn, my phone still recording. "This is my house. I have not authorized any real estate agents to be here, and it is definitely not for sale." Brittany's professional smile faltered as she glanced between my father and me. I was told this was a family property, with multiple owners agreeing to liquidate. "You were misled," I said firmly. "I am the sole owner of this house, and these people are trespassing. I changed the locks 3 days ago. How did you get in?" My mother appeared behind my father holding a small crowbar. "Robert had to get in through the back window," she said defiantly. "We have every right to be here. This house was always meant to be ours." The realtor, Brittany, took a nervous step back. "Perhaps I should come back when the ownership situation is more clarified," she said, already edging toward her car. "There is nothing to clarify," I said loudly, making sure my phone's microphone picked it up. I have the deed and the will. This property belongs to me, and only me." As Brittany made a hasty retreat, my parents' pretense of civility shattered completely. "You ungrateful little thief," my mother spat. "After everything we've done for you." "Done for me?" I repeated, my voice filled with incredulous anger. "You were barely in my life. Grandma and Grandpa raised me while you were off building your precious careers and your public image." My father took a menacing step toward me. "You have until the end of the day to get your things and get out. This is our house now." "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling up the dialer on my phone. "Go ahead," my mother sneered. "By the time they get here, we'll have documented our long-standing connection to this property. Your grandparents promised it to us years ago." As I was dialing, I noticed movement down the street. Mrs. Gable, my grandparents' next-door neighbor of 30 years, was walking her dog and had stopped to watch the commotion. Behind her, another neighbor had come out onto his porch, close enough to hear every shouted word. Then, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even had time to form, a familiar blue sedan pulled up to the curb. Beatrice Croft, my grandmother's best friend since college, got out and walked briskly toward us. "I thought that was your car, Helen," Beatrice called out to my mother, her voice deceptively sweet. "What a coincidence. I was just bringing Clara some of Margaret's favorite rose fertilizer for the garden." She turned to me. "I could hear the ruckus from the end of the street, dear. Is everything all right?" "They broke in," I explained, relief washing over me at the sight of a friendly face. "And they're trying to claim the house is theirs. They even brought a real estate agent." Beatrice's gentle expression hardened as she turned back to my parents. How interesting, especially since Margaret told me, on multiple occasions over the years, that she and Arthur wanted this house to go to Clara. In fact, we discussed it the last time I saw her, just 3 weeks before she passed. My father's face reddened. "That's not true. They promised it to us." "Did they put that in writing, Richard?" Beatrice asked calmly. "Because I know for a fact they put their actual wishes in writing with Samuel Peterson. I happened to witness one of the updates to their will myself, about 2 years ago. More neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the shouting. Among them was retired Dr. Alan Reed, who had been my grandparents' physician for decades. "What's all this about?" he asked, approaching our group on the lawn. Before anyone could answer, a police car pulled up, responding to my call. 2 officers got out, and I quickly explained the situation. "They broke into my house," I said, pointing to my parents. "I inherited it from my grandparents. I had the locks changed 3 days ago because they kept entering without my permission, and today I came home to find they'd forced a window and brought a realtor to sell it." The older officer turned to my parents. "Is this true? Did you force entry into this residence?" My father tried to regain his composure. "Officer, this is a simple family misunderstanding. My wife and I believe we have a legitimate claim to this property based on verbal promises made by my parents before they passed." "Do you have any documentation of ownership?" the officer asked. "Not yet," my father admitted, "but we are in the process of legally challenging the will." Beatrice stepped forward. "Officer, I was a close friend of Arthur and Margaret Vance for over 50 years. I personally witnessed them update their will to leave everything, including this house, to their granddaughter Clara. There was no ambiguity about their wishes." Dr. Reed nodded in agreement. "I was their physician, and both Arthur and Margaret were of completely sound mind when they made their final arrangements. They spoke to me about their decision as well." The younger officer, who had been inspecting the back of the house, returned. "There's a damaged window frame around back, consistent with forced entry," he reported. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to need to see some identification," the senior officer said firmly. "Forced entry constitutes breaking and entering, regardless of any family relationship. What happened next was surreal. My parents were ordered to leave the property immediately and were warned that I could press charges. They were made to turn over any keys or other items they had taken from the house. As they prepared to leave, my mother turned to me, her face a mask of rage and public humiliation. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You've turned our own community against us with your lies." "The only lies here came from you," I replied quietly. "Grandma and Grandpa saw through them years ago." After they drove off, the neighbors lingered, offering words of support and sharing stories about my grandparents that confirmed what I already knew. They had been beloved, respected pillars of the community who had made their wishes crystal clear. When everyone finally left and I was alone in the house again, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I sank into my grandmother's favorite armchair and sobbed, mourning not just my grandparents anymore, but the very idea of who I thought my parents were. The family I thought I knew was gone forever, replaced by a painful truth I could no longer ignore. The day after the break-in, I met with Mr. Peterson to discuss my options. He was furious about my parents' behavior and immediately helped me file for a restraining order. What they did constitutes breaking and entering, attempted property theft, and harassment, he explained as we filled out the paperwork. The restraining order will keep them away from both you and the property while we address their threats to challenge the will. Sure enough, 3 days later, we received a formal notice that my parents had filed a lawsuit contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence and questioning my grandparents' mental capacity during their final years. "This is standard procedure in these cases," Mr. Peterson assured me. "But we need to be prepared for an unpleasant battle. I suggest you hire additional counsel who specializes in estate litigation." On his recommendation, I met with an attorney named Amanda Davis, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a stellar reputation for handling contested wills. "Your case is actually quite strong," Amanda told me after reviewing all the documentation. "Your grandparents took exceptional precautions to ensure their wishes would be respected, including the psychological evaluations and their detailed documentation of their reasoning." Nevertheless, the lawsuit moved forward, and the next few months became a blur of depositions, document discoveries, and legal maneuvering. The process was emotionally draining and expensive, but Mr. Peterson had wisely set up an account from my inheritance specifically to cover any legal expenses, anticipating that a challenge was likely. During the discovery phase, some shocking information came to light. My parents' financial situation was far worse than they had let on. They weren't just facing $4 million in debts. They had accumulated over $12 million in liabilities through a series of risky investments and years of lavish spending. Even more disturbing, we found evidence that they had been pressuring my grandparents for money for years. A chain of emails revealed my father requesting loans of ever-increasing size, his tone becoming more insistent and less grateful with each transaction. "Your grandparents forgave over $3 million in loans to your parents over the last decade," Amanda told me, shaking her head as she reviewed the financial records. Yet they continued to live far beyond their means while expecting more bailouts. We also obtained testimony from my grandparents' doctors, all confirming their mental competence right up to the very end. But the most powerful evidence came from a place I never expected. While organizing my grandfather's study, I found a series of his personal journals. In them, he had documented his growing disillusionment with my parents. One entry, from just a year before he died, read, "Helen and Richard see a lifetime of careful investment as nothing but a potential windfall for their own use. They don't understand that money is a tool, not a goal. Margaret and I are increasingly certain that leaving our estate to them would be like pouring water into sand. With Clara, at least we know the values we cherish will be carried on. These journals proved invaluable in establishing my grandparents' clear state of mind and the solid reasoning behind their decision. After 3 grueling months, the court ordered a mediation attempt before proceeding to a full trial. My parents, their attorney, Amanda, Mr. Peterson, and I all gathered in a sterile conference room with a court-appointed mediator. My parents looked different, tired and strained, but their faces were set with grim determination. Their lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, presented their generous offer. They would drop the lawsuit if I agreed to give them 70% of the inheritance. This would still leave Miss Hayes with over $6 million, a very substantial sum for someone her age, he argued smoothly. And it would honor the implied intentions of the deceased to provide for their immediate family. Amanda didn't even glance at the written proposal. My client rejects this offer completely, she said firmly. The will explicitly states the decedent's intentions, which were to leave their entire estate to their granddaughter. We have overwhelming evidence supporting both their competence and their reasoning. The mediation collapsed within an hour, and we were headed to trial the following month. The courthouse was an intimidating place, all marble floors and echoing hallways. I wore a conservative blue dress that had belonged to my grandmother, which I'd had altered slightly to fit me. It felt like I was bringing a piece of her with me for strength. The trial lasted 4 days. My parents both testified, attempting to paint a picture of a loving, close relationship with my grandparents that had been poisoned by my influence. Their performance might have been convincing to someone who hadn't known the truth. When it was my turn, I spoke simply and honestly about my relationship with my grandparents, the values they taught me, and their clear communication about their wishes. I didn't try to vilify my parents. Their own actions and the evidence spoke far louder than any accusations I could make. Dr. Reed, Beatrice, and several other community members testified about my grandparents' mental clarity and their frequently expressed intentions. Mr. Peterson provided powerful testimony about the careful, deliberate process my grandparents had followed. On the final day, the judge delivered his ruling. The courtroom was dead silent as he spoke. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony in this matter, I find no grounds to invalidate the will of Arthur and Margaret Vance. The evidence overwhelmingly indicates they were of sound mind and free from undue influence when they designated their granddaughter Clara Hayes as their sole heir. Their detailed letter explaining their reasoning further supports the conclusion that this was a carefully considered decision aligned with their values. He continued, addressing my parents directly. Furthermore, the court finds the plaintiff's claims to be without merit and potentially made in bad faith, given the substantial evidence contradicting their assertions. Therefore, the plaintiffs will be responsible for the defendant's full legal costs in this matter. Relief washed through me so intensely I almost buckled. It was over. My grandparents' wishes would be honored. Outside the courthouse, my parents approached me one last time. "This is the biggest mistake of your life," my father said, his voice low and threatening. "You have destroyed this family over money." "No," I replied calmly, my voice steady for the first time in months. "You did that when you decided an inheritance was more important than a relationship." My mother's face was as cold and hard as stone. "Don't contact us again," she said. "As far as we're concerned, we no longer have a daughter." They walked away without a backward glance, and I felt a complex storm of emotions: sadness for what might have been, profound relief that the battle was over, and a strange, quiet sense of freedom. The truth, in all its ugliness, was finally out in the open. A week later, a letter from them arrived. For a fleeting moment, I hoped it might be an apology. Instead, it was one last pathetic attempt at manipulation, suggesting I had been used by my lawyers and that I would regret my actions when I eventually needed family support. I didn't respond. Some bridges once burned cannot and should not be rebuilt. In the months after the court case, I wrestled with a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated, relieved that my grandparents' legacy was safe. On the other, I mourned the permanent severing of my family and fought waves of guilt, wondering if there had been any other way. The house felt both comforting and profoundly lonely. I would walk through the rooms, touching my grandmother's quilts or my grandfather's books, finding solace in these tangible connections, but also feeling the weight of their absence. Slowly, I began to build a new kind of support system. Mr. Peterson became more than just a lawyer. He became a mentor, stopping by to check on me and share stories about my grandparents. Beatrice brought over lunch every Sunday, just as she had for my grandmother for years. Dr. Reed's wife, Vivian, invited me to join the garden club. Other neighbors and community members reached out, bringing casseroles, offering help with home repairs, creating a web of kindness that held me up. 3 months after the trial, I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Our weekly sessions helped me untangle the complicated grief of losing not only my grandparents, but also the parents I thought I had. "You're mourning multiple losses at once," she explained. "Your grandparents, your relationship with your parents, and the very story you told yourself about your family." With her guidance, I began to separate my feelings of sadness from any sense of guilt. "You can be sad about the estrangement without taking responsibility for it," she reminded me. "Your parents made their choices. You made yours." As I worked through the emotional fallout, I also had to address the practical reality of the inheritance. With Mr. Peterson's guidance, I assembled a team of ethical financial advisors who respected my priorities. "Your grandmother once told me she hoped this money would allow you to do more good in the world," he shared, "not just to accumulate more, but to extend the values they lived by." Taking that to heart, I established the Vance Legacy Fund, a foundation focused on environmental education and conservation efforts in our community. We funded scholarships for students pursuing environmental studies and supported local conservation projects. I also decided to renovate the house, carefully preserving its historic character while making it more energy efficient. It was during this renovation, tucked inside a hollowed-out book in the library, that I found another letter from my grandmother, addressed simply to Clara. This one was different from the formal letter left with the will. It was deeply personal, written in her elegant script on her favorite floral stationery. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, you have likely faced some difficult times. William and I knew our decision might cause conflict. Money has a way of revealing character, not building it. Remember that while DNA creates relatives, it is love and shared values that create true family. Some of our dearest friends became our chosen family over the years. Whatever happens, know that you are never alone. The community around you holds more support than you might realize. Lean on those connections and in time create new ones. This house has sheltered 5 generations. Make it yours. Change what needs changing, but listen to its stories. Your path forward is yours alone to choose. Trust yourself, just as we have always trusted you. With endless love, Grandma Margaret." Finding this felt like a hug from the past, a final gift of wisdom that arrived exactly when I needed it most. Around this time, I reconnected with my cousin Sophie, my mother's niece, who had been estranged from the family for years. She reached out after hearing about the court case. "Your parents did something similar to my mother years ago," she explained over coffee. "It was a much smaller inheritance, but they manipulated the situation so my mother got nothing. When she objected, they cut her off completely. That's why you never saw much of our side of the family." That conversation was a final healing piece of the puzzle. It wasn't about me. It was a long-established pattern of behavior. As the months turned into years, I settled into my new reality. The sharp pain of betrayal faded into a quiet resolve to live a life my grandparents would be proud of. The Vance Legacy Fund helped restore a local wetland, creating a nature preserve and an educational center for the community. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about my parents. They had moved to Arizona, still bitter, still telling anyone who would listen their twisted version of the story. But their words had lost the power to hurt me. I realized that money doesn't create flaws. It just magnifies what's already there. My grandparents had understood that fundamental truth. 2 years after it all began, I hosted a gathering in the garden they had loved so much. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives I had reconnected with all came. We shared stories about Margaret and Arthur and celebrated the values they stood for. Standing there, surrounded by people who had truly loved my grandparents, I finally felt at peace. The inheritance had brought pain, but it had also brought clarity. My grandparents gave me so much more than money. They gave me a blueprint for how to live, how to love, and how to navigate the hardest choices with grace. That was the real inheritance, one that could never be disputed in court or diminished by greed. Have you ever had to stand up for what's right, even when it cost you a relationship? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most difficult choices are the ones that lead us to our most authentic lives. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more journeys of finding strength in the face of family conflict. And remember to share it with someone who might need to hear that standing in their truth is always worth it, even when it's painful. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you all the courage to honor your own values, no matter what challenges you face.